Hey there everybody, Michael Gallacher, the Media Preacher, back with another top 5. Now, last week, or earlier on today, as the case may be, the magic of film editing, I did a top 5 worst sequels, in my opinion, of all time. I think it's only fair also to do the top 5, my top 5 favourite sequels of all time. To counteract the negativity perhaps, because there's a lot of negativity in the world, and so I wanted to do the sequels that I thought were the best sequels that there really have ever been made. And I think a good sequel is a film that doesn't just copy the original film and make it bigger and louder, but it's a film that in terms of character and story really adds to the richness of the original instalment, or takes it in a new and inventive way. Now, there are some notable exceptions. The Godfather Part 2 is an obvious one. It's probably one of my favourite films of all time. But I see the Godfather films as being one film, essentially. It's one story. Certainly Part 1 and 2. For me, it's one story broken down the middle, in the same way that a film like perhaps Superman, the original Superman the movie, and Superman 2 are ultimately one story that sort of feeds into each other. And that argument can be made about perhaps some of the films that I'm about to mention, but bear with me. So number 5 of my top 5 sequels of all time, number 5 I think is going to be an odd choice. It's one that no one's going to guess, but I'm putting it in the top 5 because it's so inventive and so different from the original movie. And the original movie is a movie that would be totally impossible to follow. The sequel has a different director. It has the same cast, or it has some of the same cast, but it takes on a life of its own and it becomes its own thing. And I really, really like the first sequel to this set of movies. Some of the sequels after are a little questionable. And the original movie is iconic, is a classic. And at the time the sequel was made, 20 years after the original film, it was untouchable. Which is why it's so amazing that I thought that Psycho 2 is an absolutely fantastic sequel. I say that because the story carries on in a really interesting way from the first film. It gives you a good character arc that feels satisfying, and it doesn't go in the obvious direction of Norman Bates is released from the mental institution, isn't cured, and starts butchering people. For people that haven't seen Psycho 2, I don't want to spoil what this film is about. It's a film from the early 80s. It starred Anthony Perkins reprising his role, his iconic role as Norman Bates. Of course, it wasn't directed by Alfred Hitchcock. But, there is an Arrow release now of this film that's almost certainly worth picking up. But for anybody that hasn't seen Psycho 2, it is a really inventive sequel. And in my view, it does the impossible. It makes a sequel to the original film perfectly possible. And so I put Psycho 2 in my top 5 favourite sequels of all time. The next film that I'm going to put in my top 5 favourite sequels of all time is a film that I remember seeing at the cinema, looking forward to the sequel for. The sequel didn't come out for a number of years after the original film. I think the first film was released in 1985 and the sequel was released 4 years later in 1989. I was lucky enough to see both films on their theatrical release, but I remember this sequel being so inventive in the way it was put together. It absolutely took from the original film, but then expanded on it and used the original film in a really interesting way. That sequel, at number 4, stars Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd. You probably already know what I'm talking about. It's Back to the Future Part 2. What a fantastic sequel. I would imagine everybody watching this video has already seen the Back to the Future series. If you haven't seen it, please go and see it, because certainly the first 2 films are absolutely stellar films, A+ movies. But the reason I enjoy Back to the Future Part 2 is because it uses the original film, but you see the original film and the events of the original film through different perspectives. And I thought that was so inventive on its release, and it has to make my top 5 for being so inventive and so revolutionary, because As a 10-year-old boy, that blew my mind quite literally. I've seen the film on numerous occasions over the years, and it still holds up today as being, in my view anyway, one of the best sequels that's ever been made. The next sequel I have to put into the top 5 is an obvious choice. I recently saw it at the cinema. I didn't see this film in its original release because I wasn't old enough. And seeing it at the cinema, I saw the film in a new light again. It's a film that's aged very, very well, I think. But again, it's a film that takes the first movie, which was a smaller movie, and makes a huge summer blockbuster. It stars Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was directed by Jim Cameron. My number 3 pick is Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Now, the first Terminator film is very, very original. It has a great action set pieces. It has a great plot. It has a great hero. It's a great, great film, and I always put that and RoboCop as being sort of similar films. The sequel to RoboCop makes my top 10 worst sequels of all time. The sequel to The Terminator makes my top 5 best sequels of all time. And the reason I say that is because it adds so much and goes in such a unique way. Now, in retrospect, everybody sees Arnold Schwarzenegger as the good guy. You think about Terminator 2, you don't think of him as a villain. But you have to take yourself back to 1991. You've seen the first film. Arnold Schwarzenegger was a terrific villain, one of the great villains and one of the great performances, I think, of a villain throughout the 80s, certainly. And when he came back to do the sequel, in the sequel, he's actually the hero, not the villain. And I thought that was so original to reverse his role and do a 180-degree spin on what the character is. It has to go in my top 5 favourite sequels of all time for that reason. My next sequel, my number 2 pick, it's getting hard because there are lots of good sequels. But my number 2 pick is another classic film from the 80s. It's a film I remember going to see at the cinema vividly, even though I was only 5 years old. I remember being so excited by it. Technically speaking, it's not a sequel, it's a prequel, but it was the second film in the series, so I'm allowing it to go into the top 5 on that basis. It's directed by Steven Spielberg, it stars Harrison Ford, and the movie I'm talking about is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And again, Raiders of the Lost Ark really is an untouchable film. It's a very difficult film to recreate that magic. But I think Spielberg actually recreated that magic not once but twice, particularly with the Temple of Doom. It goes off in such an original way. It's a prequel, as I say, so it's set before the events in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it's the action set pieces in that movie. I watch them now and I'm still so excited by them. And I remember how it felt to see that for the first time in the theatre and to go home with my dad who'd taken me to see it and thinking I was Indiana Jones running around the house. I'll never forget that feeling. And for that reason, it has to go in my top 5 sequels of all time. But I think it probably stands the test as one of the best action features of all time as well, because some of the set pieces in Temple of Doom are absolutely superb, and I would recommend it to anybody that hasn't seen it. Last but not least, making number 1 on my list of top 10 sequels of all time is a slightly obvious choice. As I say, The Godfather Part 2 could occupy this position quite easily, but I've actually taken it out of the list because I couldn't decide between movies. But this is part of cinema history. The first film was fantastic. It exists on its own as a perfectly formed film. But when you introduce the second and the third instalment, certainly, of this franchise, then you have one of the first major action sci-fi trilogies that was ever made. Film, of course, written by George Lucas, The Empire Strikes Back, because it takes everything from the characterization in the first film. The first film makes you care about the characters. It's a brilliant film. But the second film then delivers that amazing revelation that Darth Vader is in fact Luke Skywalker's father. And I think that is a genius piece of writing, and it's absolutely building on everything and all of the foundations that were laid in the original Star Wars film. And I don't think there's much in cinema history that really compares to that sequel. It's up there as being one of the greatest sequels that was ever made, and I think The Empire Strikes Back deservedly takes first place on my list. Though, to be fair, most of these films could occupy a number one spot on this list because they are absolutely fantastically crafted films. In terms of notable exceptions, films that don't make it onto the list, recently perhaps Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 was absolutely fantastic. I think that the Captain America films have gotten better. I really enjoyed the third instalment of Civil War, for instance. I thought that was much better than the first Captain America film, or even The Winter Soldier, which I thought was a bit long in places. But there are so many really great sequels, it's hard to decide the top 5. But I think they are my top 5 favourite sequels. Please let me know your favourite sequels in the comments underneath the video so that we can get into a discussion and have a conversation about films that we've really loved. When I'm talking about favourite sequels, I'm talking about films that develop ideas from the first film and at least try to improve on them. I always really like, and it's a bit of a guilty pleasure, Gremlins 2, for instance. I'm not sure it would ever make my top 5 because as an adult I watch it and I don't think it's anywhere near as good as the original film. But it's certainly one of those films that I would have considered and probably put into my top 5 favourite sequels as a 10-year-old boy. Anyway, until next time, this is the Media Preacher signing out.